consume you.
Long before the rise of human kingdoms, long before the first crown was ever placed upon a king's head, the heavens were already alive. Not with human life, but with beings of fire and light. Creatures that were not born from dust, time, or blood. Beings created directly by the voice of God. The Bible calls them angels, but that word barely describes what they truly were. Some were messengers, others were guardians, others ruled vast regions of the unseen spiritual world. Scripture hints at their existence when it speaks of principalities, powers, and authorities in the heavenly realms. In Ephesians 6:12, we read a warning that has echoed through centuries. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world. But there is something many people forget. These powers were not always darkness. There was a time when all of heaven reflected the perfect order of God. Seraphim surrounded his throne, proclaiming his holiness. Cherubim guarded what was sacred. Thrones upheld the invisible government of creation, and beneath them, angels, archangels, and principalities served as guardians of the human world. Everything existed in harmony. Everything served under the authority of the Creator, until something happened, a rebellion. Scripture remembers that moment with words that have echoed for thousands of years. How you have fallen from heaven, O morning star, son of the dawn. Isaiah 14:12. That fall did not destroy the angels who rebelled. It transformed them. Beings created to protect began to tempt. Beings sent to guide began to corrupt. Thus were born the spirits that Christian tradition calls fallen angels. But when people think about demons, they usually imagine the most powerful ones, the princes of darkness, the ancient enemies of heaven. And yet, not all who fell came from the highest heights of God's throne. Some belonged to orders that once walked much closer to humanity. Invisible guardians, celestial messengers, spirits entrusted with guiding nations and guarding the human heart. And when those angels fell, their influence did not disappear. It became dangerous, because before they became demons, these beings were angels. And to understand what they became, we must first understand what they once were.
The rebellion in heaven.
If these spirits were once angels, then an inevitable question emerges. How can a being created in the presence of God fall? How can light become darkness? Scripture does not describe every detail of this event, but throughout the Bible, we find fragments of a much larger story, a story about a rebellion that began in heaven, because long before corruption reached humanity, it first touched the spiritual world. God created angels as servants of his will. They were not gods. They were not equal to the Creator. They were powerful creatures, yes, but still creatures. Spiritual beings designed to fulfill specific roles within the order of heaven. Some were sent as messengers. Others guarded spiritual territories. Others held authority over vast regions of the unseen realm. The book of Psalms describes their nature in a single powerful line. He makes his angels spirits, his ministers a flaming fire. Psalm 104:4. Angels were created to serve, to obey, to reflect the will of the eternal God. But among them something emerged that had never existed in heaven before: pride. One of the most haunting passages of the Old Testament appears in the words of the prophet Isaiah, describing the fall of a being who once shone among the hosts of heaven. How you have fallen from heaven, O morning star, son of the dawn, you who once laid low the nations. Isaiah 14:12. For centuries, Christian interpreters have seen in these words an echo of the first spiritual rebellion, the fall of an angel who chose to exalt himself rather than serve God. Over time, the title Morning Star became associated with a figure known in Christian tradition as Lucifer. But in this story, he is not the only figure, because the rebellion of heaven was not a solitary act. When pride entered the heart of one angel, corruption began to spread. Other spirits who lived within the order of heaven chose the same path. Obedience gave way to ambition, Service gave way to the desire for power. The book of Revelation offers a symbolic vision of that moment. In the prophetic scene, the Apostle John describes a cosmic conflict. There was war in heaven. Revelation 12:7, spiritual forces clashed, and those who rebelled against the authority of God were cast out of their original place. But the fall did not erase their nature. It did not remove their intelligence. It did not strip them of their spiritual power. What changed was their purpose. Beings who once served the order of heaven began to oppose it. Beings who once protected began to corrupt. Beings who once guided began to deceive. Over time, these spirits would be known by many names. Demons, evil spirits, fallen angels. But something crucial must be understood. Not all of them came from the same place in heaven. Some belonged to the highest orders near the throne of God, but others came from ranks much closer to the human world. Angels, archangels, principalities, spirits originally created to guide nations, protect humanity, and influence the unfolding of history. And when those angels fell, their influence did not disappear. It became dangerous, because the rebellion of heaven did not only corrupt the highest beings, it also reached the orders that once stood closest to humanity. Angels, archangels, principalities, powers, virtues, beings who once carried divine authority, and who now use that authority in very different ways. To understand who these spirits were, and how their purpose became corruption, we must first understand how heaven itself was organized, because the angelic world was never chaos. It was structure, hierarchy, an order designed by God. And within that order, every being had a role, until some chose to abandon it.
The order of heaven.
To understand who these spirits truly were, we must first understand how heaven itself was organized. Because the angelic world was never a chaotic realm, filled with wandering spirits. God created order, a structure, a spiritual hierarchy in which every angel had a purpose within creation. For centuries, Christian theologians studying the scriptures described this celestial structure as three great hierarchies of angels. Not all angels carried the same authority. Not all served in the same way. Yet all existed under the sovereignty of the eternal God. The first hierarchy stood closest to the divine throne. Here were the seraphim, the cherubim, and the mysterious beings known as the thrones. These were not messengers sent to humanity. Their existence was tied directly to the presence of God himself. Seraphim are described in the visions of the prophet Isaiah as fiery beings who surround the throne of God, proclaiming without ceasing, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts." Isaiah 6:3. Cherubim appear throughout Scripture as guardians of what is sacred. In the book of Genesis, God places cherubim at the entrance of Eden to guard the way to the tree of life. And the thrones, beings difficult to describe in human language, associated with the visions of the prophet Ezekiel, living wheels filled with eyes, symbols of divine authority and the mysterious governance of heaven. Beneath this first hierarchy existed another order of spiritual authority. The second hierarchy, the dominions, the virtues, and the powers. These beings were associated with the transmission of divine power throughout creation. Dominions were often described as administrators of heavenly order, overseeing the harmony of the spiritual world. Virtues were connected with the manifestation of divine strength, the power through which miracles and acts of spiritual transformation take place. And the powers were believed to maintain the balance between spiritual forces that interact with the world. Finally, there was a third hierarchy, the order most closely connected with human history: the principalities, the archangels, and the angels. Principalities were believed to watch over nations and peoples. Archangels carried messages of great importance, appearing at decisive moments in the unfolding of history, and angels themselves served as messengers, protectors and unseen guardians among humanity. For a time, this entire structure functioned in perfect harmony. Every hierarchy fulfilled its purpose. Every being served under the authority of God. But when the rebellion began in heaven, that structure began to fracture. Corruption did not remain confined to the highest realms of the celestial order. It spread, reaching the orders that once stood closest to the human world. Angels, archangels, principalities, spirits originally sent to guide, protect, and influence the destiny of nations, but whose fall transformed their mission into something far darker. And some of those spirits, according to ancient traditions, still retain fragments of the power they once received from heaven. Now we will begin to explore several of them, beings whose stories reveal a disturbing truth, that even the guardians of heaven can fall.
The fall of the Guardians.
Even the guardians of heaven can fall, and some of the spirits who turned away from God did not come from the highest ranks that surrounded his throne. Many belonged to orders that once stood much closer to humanity. Angels sent to protect, archangels entrusted with delivering decisive messages, principalities assigned to watch over nations and peoples. For centuries, Christian tradition has taught that these beings carried very specific responsibilities within the order created by God. Some guided nations, some protected communities, others influenced the human conscience in subtle ways, inspiring courage, warning against danger, or gently turning the heart toward what is good. They were unseen guardians, silent custodians of the human world. But when the rebellion of heaven began, some of these guardians chose another path. They did not cease to exist. They did not lose all the power they had once been given, but their purpose changed. The gifts they had received to protect began to be used to tempt. The influence that once guided toward truth began to bend toward corruption. The authority that once served God began to resist him. Thus emerged some of the spirits later described in the writings of Christian demonology, beings who were once angels, but who had become something else. To understand who they are, we must first understand what they were, because every one of these spirits follows the same unsettling pattern. First, there was the angel, a being created with a clear purpose within the order of heaven. Then came corruption, the moment when that purpose began to distort, when the influence meant to protect, humanity slowly turned towards something darker. And finally, the demon, a spirit that still retains fragments of its original nature, yet now uses that influence to deceive, manipulate, and weaken the human heart. Angel, corruption. Demon. This pattern appears again and again in the stories of fallen spirits, because when an angel turns away from the will of God, it does not simply vanish, it changes. And some of these beings, according to ancient testimonies, still attempt to influence the human world today, not as rulers of fiery kingdoms beneath the earth, but in ways far more subtle, closer, more dangerous. They influence decisions, they weaken resolve, they plant doubts. The story of these spirits begins with some of the orders that once stood closest to human experience. Angels, archangels, principalities, guardians who once walked invisibly among nations, but whose fall transformed their mission into something very different. The first of them belonged to the order of the archangels, a being who, according to the accounts of the 17th century, Dominican theologian Sebastian Michaelis once held authority within the celestial order. His name was Olivier, and his fall reveals how even a messenger of heaven can become a spirit of destruction.
The fall of the third hierarchy.
When God created the spiritual world, he did not create a chaotic realm filled with creatures without purpose. Every being was placed within an order. Every angel received a role. Some contemplated the glory of God, others transmitted the power of heaven, and others stood closer to the unfolding story of humanity, guiding nations, delivering divine messages, and protecting the world under the authority of God. Among these were the beings that theologians described as the third hierarchy of heaven, the principalities, the archangels, and the angels. These were the spirits that most directly interacted with the human world, invisible guardians of nations, messengers of divine decisions, watchers over the destiny of civilizations. For a time, they fulfilled their mission faithfully, but when the rebellion spread through heaven, Even some of these guardians turned away from the purpose God had given them. The first spirit associated with this fall, according to accounts recorded by the Dominican theologian Sebastian Michaelis in the 17th century, belonged to the order of the archangels. His name was Olivier. In his original state, Olivier would have been a messenger of great authority. Archangels in Christian tradition are not ordinary angels. They are heralds of decisive moments. But he being sent when the will of God must be revealed with clarity in the history of the world. In Scripture, we see examples of this authority when the archangel Gabriel announces the births of John the Baptist and Jesus, or when Michael appears as a protector of God's people. An archangel was meant to reflect divine justice, clarity, and authority. One might imagine Olivier in his original form as a being of radiant light, wings brilliant and vast, a presence that inspired reverence rather than fear. His eyes reflecting wisdom, his voice carrying the weight of heaven's decrees. But when corruption reached his heart, that image began to change. According to the tradition surrounding this spirit, Olivier came to represent spiritual cruelty. The messenger meant to proclaim truth became a spirit that incites brutality, harsh judgment, and contempt for the weak. In symbolic descriptions, the transformation is striking. Wings once radiant grow dark. The once majestic messenger becomes severe and threatening, and the herald of heaven turns into a force that feeds human violence. Once again, the pattern appears. First the angel, then the corruption, and finally, the demon. The second spirit associated with this fallen hierarchy comes from the most familiar order of heaven, the angels. His name is Luvart. Angels, according to Scripture, are the messengers closest to the human experience. They warn, protect, guide, and sometimes appear when human lives stand at crucial crossroads. The book of Hebrews even hints that angels may sometimes walk unnoticed among humanity. Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. Hebrews 13:2. An angel's role was to strengthen faith, to encourage trust, and to remind humanity that God had not abandoned his creation. In his original state, Luvart may have been imagined as a quiet guardian, a luminous presence whose influence gently inclined the human heart toward hope and trust in God. But after the fall, this influence was twisted. Luvart came to represent incredulity, not the honest doubt that seeks understanding, but the corrosive skepticism that slowly erodes faith. Instead of strengthening belief, this spirit whispers that truth cannot be trusted, that faith is foolish, that divine authority deserves suspicion. In symbolic imagery, this transformation is described as light gradually fading, a once clear presence now surrounded by shadow, creating confusion where there once was guidance. The angel who once strengthened faith becomes a voice that weakens it. The third spirit connected to this fallen hierarchy comes from another order, the principalities. His name is Verrier. In Christian tradition, principalities were believed to watch over nations and cultures. The book of Daniel hints at this mysterious reality when it speaks of the Prince of Persia opposing a heavenly messenger. This suggests that some angels held influence over entire regions of the world, guiding the spiritual development of peoples and civilizations. A principality was meant to exercise authority with wisdom, to guide nations toward justice, to protect the spiritual balance of the world. One might imagine Verrier in his original form as a majestic ruler, among spirits, a being surrounded by symbols of authority, watching over the destiny of nations with patience and wisdom. But when this authority became corrupted, it transformed into something very different. According to demonological tradition, Verrier came to represent intellectual pride, not true wisdom, but the arrogance that convinces humanity it no longer needs God. The spirit that once guided civilizations toward truth becomes an influence that encourages cultures to trust only their own knowledge, elevating human reason as the ultimate authority. In symbolic depictions, Verrier's transformation is often imagined as a crowned spirit whose authority becomes distorted, a ruler whose crown represents not wisdom, but arrogance. These three spirits reveal something deeply unsettling about the nature of spiritual corruption. Not all fallen angels came from the highest ranks of heaven. Some once belonged to the orders created to guide humanity. Archangels who proclaimed truth, angels who strengthened faith, principalities who protected nations. But when they turned away from the will of God, their influence did not disappear, it changed. And instead of protecting humanity, they began to exploit its weaknesses. Yet even these spirits were not the only ones whose fall disrupted the order God had created in heaven. Other beings, belonging to even more powerful ranks of the spiritual world, would undergo the same transformation. Because the rebellion of heaven did not stop at one level of creation, and some of the spirits who fell afterward held an influence far deeper over the human heart. But these were not the only fallen spirits among the lower heavens.
The fallen of the second hierarchy.
But the spirits of the third hierarchy were not the only ones whose fall disturbed the order God had established in heaven. Ancient Christian traditions also speak of spirits who once belonged to a different level of authority within the celestial world, a level closer to the flow of divine power itself. These beings belonged to what theologians described as the second hierarchy of heaven. The dominions, the virtues, and the powers. These were not merely messengers or guardians of nations. Their role was far greater. They were entrusted with maintaining balance in the unseen realm, transmitting divine authority throughout creation, and preserving the spiritual order established by God. For a time, these beings fulfilled their purpose faithfully, but when rebellion spread through heaven, some of them fell as well. And when a spirit of this rank becomes corrupted, the influence it exerts over the human world can become far more dangerous. One of these spirits is known as Carreau, according to the accounts collected by the Dominican theologian Sebastian Michaelis. Carreau once belonged to the Order of the Powers. In Christian theology, the powers were believed to act as guardians of spiritual equilibrium. They maintained order in the invisible realm and prevented chaos from spreading into the world. A being of this order might be imagined as a powerful yet composed figure, a spirit whose presence radiated discipline and stability, vast wings representing protection, a gaze reflecting unwavering focus. Its task was clear: preserve balance within God's creation. But when that purpose was corrupted, the very force meant to maintain harmony began to distort the human heart. Carreau became associated with hardness of heart. The spirit that once preserved balance now inspires indifference, coldness, and the refusal to show compassion. Instead of guiding humanity toward justice, this influence encourages people to ignore suffering. It is the whisper that tells a person to look away from the pain of others. The voice that transforms compassion into apathy, the corruption of a guardian of balance, turned into a force that hardens the human soul. Another spirit associated with this fallen hierarchy is Carnivale. Like Carreau, Carnivale is also linked to the Order of the Powers. But the corruption attributed to this spirit follows a different path. Originally, a spirit of this rank would have reflected discipline and harmony within the divine structure of creation. One might imagine Carnivale in his original form as a radiant being of order, a presence that brought clarity wherever spiritual confusion threatened to arise. But when that order collapsed, discipline turned into excess. Harmony turned into chaos. According to demonological tradition, Carnivale came to represent moral corruption and reckless indulgence. The influence that once encouraged balance now pushes humanity toward uncontrolled desire, toward celebration without restraint, toward forgetting every form of spiritual discipline. Where there was once harmony, there is now disorder. Where there was once clarity, there is now confusion. Another spirit mentioned in these accounts is Oeillet. In the writings attributed to Michaelis, Oeillet is associated with the breaking of sacred commitments. His original rank is often connected with the dominions, spirits responsible for administering the order of heaven and transmitting divine authority to the lower ranks. A being of this order would have embodied dignity and structure, a spiritual administrator within the invisible government of heaven. But when that purpose was corrupted, loyalty turned into betrayal. Oeillet became associated with spiritual infidelity, the influence that persuades people to abandon sacred promises, the whisper that convinces someone that commitment no longer matters, the subtle corruption that turns vows into empty words, a guardian of order, transformed into a spirit that encourages the breaking of what was once considered holy. Among the spirits of this hierarchy appears another name long associated with one of the most powerful human temptations. His name is Rosier. According to demonological tradition, Rosier once belonged to the Order of the Dominions, spirits entrusted with transmitting divine governance through the celestial hierarchy. A being of this rank would have been majestic, reflecting beauty, authority, and control. One might imagine Rosier in his original form as a radiant figure of harmony, a spirit whose presence reflected the elegance of divine order. But when that order became corrupted, even beauty could become a source of temptation. Rosier came to represent lust, the spirit that distorts natural human attraction into obsession, the influence that transforms desire into something that consumes the will. In many symbolic depictions, Rosier is imagined as a being whose original beauty has not completely disappeared, but whose radiance has become twisted, as if light itself had been bent into something darker, a haunting reminder that even gifts created by God can become dangerous when separated from their purpose. And finally, within this hierarchy appears a spirit whose influence is considered among the most dangerous of them all. His name is Belias. According to the same traditions, Belias once belonged to the Order of the Virtues. In Christian theology, the virtues were associated with the manifestation of divine strength in the world. They were often linked with miracles, spiritual power, and the visible expression of God's authority within creation. A being of this order would have been extraordinary, even among angels, a spirit whose very existence reflected the power flowing from God into the universe. But when that power became corrupted, the result was devastating. Belias came to represent religious pride, not the obvious arrogance that appears through violence or cruelty, but something far more subtle, the temptation that convinces a person that their faith makes them superior to others, the influence that transforms spirituality into self-exaltation, the voice that whispers that one's own righteousness is enough. In symbolic descriptions, Belias often appears as a being who still retains traces of his ancient glory, a majestic figure whose light remains visible, yet strangely cold, a virtue that has turned into pride, a spiritual authority that no longer points toward God, but toward itself. And here something important must be remembered. The temptations associated with these spirits do not always appear in dramatic ways. Often they begin as quiet thoughts, subtle suggestions, small inclinations of the heart. But Scripture also reminds us of a deeper truth. No fallen spirit holds absolute authority over those who remain rooted in God. For centuries, Christian teaching has affirmed that these temptations can be resisted through humility, through faith, through discipline, because the influence of corruption only grows when the human heart turns away from the Creator. Yet even these spirits of the second hierarchy were not the most powerful beings who had fallen. Spirits whose original position stood much closer to the throne of God. And when those beings fell, the darkness that followed was far greater. Among the spirits associated with this hierarchy, one stands apart from the others. Not necessarily because of raw power, but because of the nature of his temptation. Because some forms of corruption are obvious: violence, cruelty, chaos. But others hide behind something that appears righteous. That spirit is Belias. According to the demonological accounts recorded by the Dominican theologian Sebastian Michaelis, in the 17th century, Belias originally belonged to the Order of the Virtues. Within Christian theology, the virtues were closely connected to the power of God itself. They were associated with the manifestation of divine strength in the world, miracles, spiritual authority, and moments when the power of heaven became visible within creation. A being of this order would have been extraordinary. One might imagine Belias in his original form, surrounded by brilliant light, a majestic spirit whose presence reminded all creation that true power flows from God alone. But when rebellion reached his heart, that power became distorted. Belias came to represent a particularly dangerous form of corruption. Religious pride, not the arrogance that appears openly through cruelty or domination, but something far more subtle, the voice that convinces a person that their faith makes them superior, the temptation that transforms devotion into self-exaltation, the illusion that one's own righteousness is enough. In symbolic descriptions, Belias is often imagined as a being who still carries traces of his former glory, a majestic figure whose light remains visible, yet strangely cold, a virtue that has become pride. But even this corruption has a limit, because Scripture reminds us of a simple and powerful truth. God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. James 4:6. Pride grows in arrogance, but it collapses before humility. And when the human heart remains turned toward God, even the most subtle temptations lose their power. Yet the spirits we have seen so far were not the most powerful beings who had fallen. There were others. Spirits whose original place stood much closer to the throne of God. And when those beings fell, the darkness they left behind was far greater.
The lesson behind the fall.
The stories we have explored reveal something unsettling about the spiritual world. Even angels can fall. Beings created in the presence of God, entrusted with power and purpose within the order of heaven, were capable of turning away from the will of their Creator. And that fall reminds us of an important truth. Temptation is real. Spiritual corruption exists. Sometimes it appears through cruelty or violence, sometimes through doubt, pride, or desire, and sometimes it hides behind things that appear righteous. But Scripture also reminds us of something even greater. No fallen spirit holds ultimate authority over humanity. The rebellion of angels did not destroy the order created by God. It did not weaken his power. It did not challenge his sovereignty. The spiritual world still exists under the authority of the Creator. The angels were created by God, and the fallen angels are still his creatures. No matter how powerful they may appear, none of them stand above the will of the one who made them. The Bible repeats this truth again and again. God remains sovereign over all creation, visible and invisible. And when the human heart turns toward him with humility, faith, and discipline, even the darkest influences lose their power, because no shadow can overcome the light that comes from God. No fallen spirit stands above the authority of God.
The most powerful have yet to come.
The spirits we have explored so far were once guardians within the lower orders of heaven. Angels, archangels, principalities, beings whose mission was closely tied to the human world. Invisible protectors, messengers of divine will, watchers over nations and hearts. But the rebellion of heaven did not end there, because some of the spirits who turned away from God belonged to orders far closer to the divine throne, beings whose very existence was bound to the presence of God himself. The seraphim, the cherubim, the thrones, creatures described in the visions of Scripture as beings of fire, covered in eyes, surrounded by overwhelming glory and spiritual power. Beings who proclaimed the holiness of God and upheld the order of heaven. And yet, some of them also fell. Ancient traditions have associated certain fallen spirits with these higher orders of heaven, names that have echoed through centuries of theological reflection and mysterious writings. Among them are figures known as some of the most feared spirits in all demonology: Beelzebub, Leviathan, Asmodeus, Astaroth. Spirits who, according to these traditions, once stood far closer to the throne of God than any human mind could imagine. But before we continue this story, there is an important question. Throughout this video, we have spoken about temptations that feel very real. Cruelty, doubt, pride, desire. And perhaps, while listening to these stories, something sounded familiar. Perhaps you have felt that quiet struggle within your own heart. The moment when doubt whispers, when pride rises, when temptation presses against your spirit. If you have ever felt that inner battle, you are not alone. For centuries, humanity has described this struggle as a spiritual conflict, a tension between the human will and the unseen influences that attempt to guide it. If you want, you can share your experience. Have you ever felt that struggle? Have you ever felt as if one of these forces was whispering doubt, pride, or temptation into your mind? Because the story of fallen angels is not only an ancient story, it is also a reflection of the battles that still take place within the human heart. But what we have seen so far is only the beginning, because the spirits we explored belonged to ranks that, while powerful, were not the closest to the throne of God. Those who fell from the highest heavens were something else entirely, beings whose fall shook the very structure of heaven. And to understand who they were and what they became, we must look deeper into the mysteries of the celestial hierarchy. Because some of the angels who fell were not merely messengers. They were guardians of the throne itself, and their fall changed the history of heaven forever.